I have with me Tony Gao from Fuchsia. At what pain point does a startup usually realize that compliance is a serious problem?
Yeah, I think it varies between the different types of hardware. There is like this huge barrier that takes like maybe at least like a few months and maybe a couple $100,000 to get over before you start selling your product. For robotics, the regulations are not super enforced, but they definitely are at like the higher levels. So if you're a robot company selling to Fortune 500s, that is a requirement for them. And if you're trying to go through retailers like Walmart, Amazon, Costco, they also have these like strict requirements that you need to comply with. So that's the point where those hardware companies start thinking about compliance and when it starts affecting them.
So, what are the biggest mistakes founders make when trying to certify a product?
The biggest mistake is just trying to handle too much of it themselves. I think founders, at least founders without that much experience with regulatory compliance and testing and all that, they see like these huge prices and these like really long timelines. Oftentimes that just ends up making things worse because they're also handling sales, they're handling engineering, everything that's like typically handled by the founders in a startup while also trying to do this compliance stuff. It's relatively new to them. They have to talk with a bunch of testing labs, talk with a bunch of consultants, figure out who to hire. That is a huge problem for founders who have better things to do. We're trying to do a better way to do managed compliance where we have actual timelines that the founders can work with. We have reasonable prices and we kind of take the compliance workload off of these founders who have sales and engineering to do.
Why has compliance historically favored big companies?
Compliance and like the regulatory stuff is relatively like relationship heavy. So the big companies, they've worked with a bunch of testing labs. They've pushed out products, gotten them to market. They have this experience going through the process and also the connections they've gained through like doing this over and over again. They have dedicated people in-house to figure out all this stuff for them. For founders and especially founders who haven't done testing or like compliance before, they have to approach labs cold. They may not have like the experience or the relationships to make the process like quick and easy and relatively cheap.
What's the difference between building a cool prototype and building something that can actually ship at scale?
When you think about shipping things and selling things at scale, one of the factors is compliance and the other is just manufacturing and like getting it into mass production at like a okay cost. For a lot of startups, they're just trying to build a prototype or some product that works. Oftentimes, like that means sourcing cheap components. I guess like the cheapest components that work to iterate fast on their design. Then when they're ready to go into mass production or they're ready to get certified, there has to be a lot of redesigns. You have to reorder components or find like components that are pre-certified or different components that might be more expensive. You need to alter the design to make it easier and cheaper to manufacture. The supply chain and the regulatory side is really the difference between a kind of like hobby prototype and something that can ship at scale.
So, you recently wrote about the FCC phasing out Chinese labs for US bound hardware. So, what ripple effects does that create?
This like move is part of the shift to like bringing back manufacturing and like everything related to supply chain to the US. There will be a lot more supply chain inside the US now instead of China. I think that's on the political agenda and this like change also makes it so that like even if you produce in China, you have to test in the US. It's going to make it harder for Chinese companies to sell hardware as well. I think a lot of the talk has been around just like American, European companies that outsource their production to China. But another big thing is that like, especially in robotics, China produces a lot of the hardware that these companies in the US and EU use. Moving the testing outside of China will make it harder for Chinese companies to sell because their connections are in China and their testing is definitely all done in China. So it's going to make it more difficult for them to operate.
So, are robotics companies prepared for the regulatory environment that's coming?
I think robotics is at a very early stage and deployments are also relatively early stage. I've talked to a few robotics companies who have really been like impacted by regulators. It can really like mess things up because the regulators will ask for you to get this certification. And in order to get that certification, you might need to reorder your components and redesign. And that takes up time and also money and kind of like messes up your plans for like distribution and definitely messes up your timeline for deployments. The state of regulatory compliance in robotics right now is very like unclear, especially because like there aren't that many standards and regulators kind of move slow in this space. So it is a problem for robotics companies to like even think about what they should do. There's no like standards or there wasn't like all this robotics like 2 years ago. Regulatory compliance for robotics, like specifically robotics,
Hmm.
is not mature. So whatever comes at these companies will definitely be a surprise. If there's no clear standard or like path for certification and compliance, a lot of robotics companies opt to just not think about it until it becomes a problem. But when it becomes a problem, it's like a very big problem. Compliance for hardware, it takes like months to do that, and it will definitely involve redesigns, which can really mess up some companies, especially at the early stage.
What does the future look like if compliance becomes dramatically faster and cheaper?
I think the future that I'm hoping for is one where like the barrier to entry for selling a hardware product is a lot lower. So we'll see a lot more innovation, a lot more products actually get to market and like face the test of like, is it a good product or not? So hopefully it'll mean better products, more innovative products get to market and not just the products that come out of big corporations or the products that have like, or the products that are like venture backed. Hopefully everyone who knows how to build hardware and knows how to like think through ideas and has innovative ideas can get their products to market.
So, and the last question's about you. So, you're pretty young to be tackling something deep in the hardware stack. So, how did you end up here?
I've gained like a interest in hardware like throughout like my college time and also being at home. My both my parents are engineers. Something that really interests me about this space is just how young robotics is and kind of shaping the future of like regulation and compliance for robotics so that it doesn't like slow innovation down. Because what I really want to see is all these robots, like all these demos in the real world. There's not many people from my background who are doing regulatory compliance, but
Yeah.
just from conversations with hardware founders and people that like compliance and like the current space is kind of who are at like kind of a disadvantage. There's a lot of disruption that could happen and a lot of changes that should happen as people create more hardware and create robots to do different things. The opportunity to kind of like shape compliance for robotics is very early. I've talked to some people developing standards for like industrial robots, people who are developing standards that are in progress for humanoids and like dynamic robots. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to like make things more more favorable for founders and startups because that is most of robotics today. So I see a lot of opportunity to do actual like regulatory impacts there, kind of shaping the regulations to be more favorable for founders.